In several videos, I've discussed the Psalms fragment that was discovered at Nahal Hever. The generally accepted view is that this text reads Kaf Aleph Resh Vav, which we would most naturally interpret as a lengthened form of Kaf Resh Vav. It could therefore be translated as they dug, or perhaps they pierced. In several videos, however, Kipp Davis has argued that this reading is incorrect and suggests that it's motivated by Christian apologetics and not by an honest handling of the data. He offers several arguments for why the text should be read as Kaf Aleph Resh Yod, Ka'ari, like a lion. I've already addressed most of his arguments in previous videos. For example, in this video, I discuss how the scribe who wrote the Nahal Hever manuscript carefully differentiated his yods from his vavs. And in this video, I discuss the main problems with the Ka'ari reading. In the present video, I'd like to address an argument that Davis makes about the orthography of the Nahal Hever manuscript. Orthography has to do with patterns of spelling.
The word in the Nahal Hever Psalm scroll, Kaf Aleph Resh Vav, most likely cannot be construed as a lengthened form of Karu, meaning they dug, because the orthography in this scroll is extremely defective, meaning very short. Orthography is the word used to describe spelling conventions, and within the Nahal Hever Psalm scroll, the spelling overall is remarkably short throughout. There is only one single instance in this entire scroll from Nahal Hever where the scribe lengthened a word like this. This is highly significant since in 4 other places where the Masoretic text has preserved vowel letters or lengthened words, the Nahal Hever Psalm scroll has not. The point is driven home by the practically bizarre appearance of a vowel letter aleph in a verb, like it appears here. In fact, in an exhaustive search of every verb from the Hebrew Dead Sea Scrolls, there is but one comparable example of this orthographic anomaly. This occurs in the Great Isaiah Scroll, column 51, line 4. This is Gamalam. He has rewarded them. That's Isaiah 63, verse 7. But this is in a manuscript which is described as one that usually exhibits longer forms than those of the Masoretic text. In short, a long form of this type would be astonishingly unexpected in a manuscript like this, the Nahal Hever Psalm scroll, which contains almost no, even common, instances of long spelling.
As you just heard, Davis argues that the scribe from the Nahal Hever manuscript wrote with an extremely defective orthography.
The orthography in this scroll is extremely defective.
This doesn't mean that the scribe had lousy penmanship. The term defective here refers to a shorter kind of spelling. In a previous video, I talked about the ancient scribal practice of inserting certain letters, like yods, vavs, heys, and alephs, as vowel indicators. The technical term for these inserted letters is matris lectionis, or in the singular, mater lectionis. You see, the rules for spelling in the ancient world were a bit less fixed than they are today. So scribes would often use these matris lectionis, but then they didn't have to. They could also write with fewer vowel markers. We call this way of writing defective rather than plene, or full. Spelling patterns may have been largely a matter of personal preference. Hence, if a scribe really liked defective spellings and encountered a fuller spelling in the manuscript that he was using, it's possible that he would have just dispensed with the vowel markers and copied the word down in a defective form. Well, Kipp Davis seems to think that this is the kind of scribe that we're dealing with in the Nahal Hever scroll. This scribe, he thinks, really disliked longer spellings. As proof of this, he refers us to this chart in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume, number 38. The words with blue boxes around them are defective or shorter spellings, and the ones with the green boxes are the plene or longer spellings. Davis points out that there's only one instance where the Nahal Hever manuscript preserves a spelling that's longer than the standard Masoretic text. He concludes from this that the word we've been looking at in this fragment can't possibly be karu, kaf aleph resh vav, because this would require us to read the aleph as a mater lectionis, and the scribe who wrote this manuscript hated these kinds of vowel markers and shunned them like the plague.
The Nahal Hever Psalm Scroll contains almost no, even common, instances of long spelling. There is only one single instance in this entire scroll from Nahal Hever where the scribe lengthened a word like this.
I think there are several problems with Davis's argumentation here. For one thing, the scribe that we're talking about clearly did not shun all longer spellings. Davis describes the Nahal Hever manuscript as extremely short, and he puts this in quotes, as if he has given us some scholarly opinion. But the editors in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume characterized this manuscript as, quote, sparing, perhaps more so than the Masoretic text. This is a far cry from extremely short. The editors also speak of the manuscript as having a, quote, close textual affinity with the Leningrad Codex, so much so that they were able to reconstruct its missing portions with a high degree of confidence. So I don't know why Davis puts the words extremely short in quotes. Maybe he's quoting himself? I don't know. I'd be curious, though, if anyone else has ever characterized the manuscript in this way, because I don't think it's very accurate. Anyway, Davis seems to think that this chart in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume is giving us some kind of exhaustive list of long and short spellings in the manuscript. But the chart is only giving us a few illustrative examples of the scribe's writing style. There are many more fuller spellings in the manuscript that aren't listed here. We'll look at some of those in just a minute. Also, you can see that even in this chart, there are in fact 3 longer spellings listed, not just one. Now, it's true that only one of them is longer than the so-called Masoretic text. But so what? The so-called Masoretic text, which I'll refer to here as the received Masoretic text, isn't what defines whether a manuscript ought to be characterized as long or short. The received Masoretic text is based primarily on the Leningrad Codex, but that codex is relatively full. There are many other surviving manuscripts from the Middle Ages that contain readings that are shorter than the ones that we find in this manuscript from Nahal Hever. Let me illustrate what I'm saying here. This is fragment 2 in the Leon Levy digital collection. I've once again placed blue boxes around the words with defective spellings and a green box around OT, which has a fuller spelling. Now, you might be wondering how I've determined which spellings here are defective and which ones are full. This is an interesting question to ponder because it underscores the fact that we're dealing here with relative terms. A spelling will seem full or defective depending on which manuscript or manuscripts we're comparing it with. What we now call the Masoretic text, or what I'm calling the received Masoretic text, is, as I just mentioned, based primarily on the Leningrad Codex of the 11th century. But why should the Leningrad Codex be seen as the standard of measurement here? There are many manuscripts, even within the Masoretic tradition, that could be classified as more sparing than the Leningrad Codex. That's why it seems very arbitrary and silly to characterize a manuscript from the Dead Sea Scrolls as defective or full by simply comparing it to the Leningrad Codex. It seems much more scholarly and meaningful to define these terms by what we find in many different manuscripts, such as the ones that were cataloged by Benjamin Kennicott in his now dated, but still very important, Vetus Testamentum Hebraicum. When compared with the manuscripts in Kennicott, we find that the Nahal Hever manuscript actually attests many spellings that we could characterize as plene, or fuller. And so again in this fragment, fragment 2 in the Leon Levy digital collection, although we find this one reading, padita, that's shorter than what we find in the received Masoretic text, we find another word, ot, that's longer than what we find in many other medieval manuscripts. Fragment 6, which is the fragment that we've been most concerned about, actually attests, on my tally, 7 fuller spellings and only 3 defective ones. I've once again highlighted those in this slide. Of course, I've included kāru as one of these full spellings, but contrary to what Kipp Davis suggests, there wouldn't be anything extraordinary about finding a fuller spelling here. You can see that this word is literally surrounded by fuller spellings. Look at it on this chart. Actually, I had to discuss this particular fragment on 2 separate charts because there were so many fuller spellings that I couldn't fit them all onto one slide. So we'll look first at verses 15 through 16 and then move on to verses 17 through 20 in the next slide. In verse 15, the Nahal Hever manuscript reads, Atzmotai, my bones, with a vav after the mem, unlike the shorter spelling that we find in other manuscripts. In verse 16, it reads, ul shoni, with a vav after the shin, unlike the shorter spelling that we find in other manuscripts. In verse 16, our manuscript has malkochai, written with a vav after the kof, to indicate the long O vowel, and this agrees with the received Masoretic text, but many other manuscripts attest a shorter reading without the vav. So that's 3 full spellings in just 2 verses. Now in verse 16, we also seem to have a defective spelling, since mudbak is spelled without the vav. This spelling would count as short if we were to compare it with many manuscripts, but it wouldn't be short if we compared it to the Masoretic text. So I guess if we were to assess this reading according to the logic of Kipp Davis, we would have to conclude that it doesn't actually count as a short reading, since it doesn't depart from the Leningrad Codex. See how that works? Moving on to verse 17, we've got hikifuni spelled with a yod after the kof, which we could characterize as a fuller spelling, at least if we were comparing it with many of the manuscripts mentioned in Kennicott. And I'll skip over the other fuller spelling in verse 17, since we already know what that one is. In verse 19, we've got 2 more fuller spellings, yapilu and goral. And then we've got 2 defective spellings in verses 17 and 20, which match the received Masoretic text and many other manuscripts beyond just the Leningrad Codex. Now, since these agree, once again, with the received Masoretic text, should we still count them as defective? Well, since Kipp Davis wants to show that this manuscript is extremely short, he probably wants to identify as many defective spellings as he can. So I doubt that he's going to say that these aren't really defective spellings. But if I were to respond by saying that these don't actually count as defective spellings, since they don't depart from the Leningrad Codex, I'd be using the very same kind of logic that he's been using, except in reverse. Because that's the sort of tactic that he's going to use when I point to all of these other fuller spellings. He's going to say that those don't count as fuller spellings because they agree with the Leningrad Codex. But as they say, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if these can be counted as defective spellings, then these can be counted as fuller spellings. Okay, and then fragment 3 is the last one we'll look at, not because there aren't more of these fuller spellings, but just because I don't want to labor the point so much that people turn off the video. This fragment contains verses from Psalm 23. In verse 2, we've got the verb yarbitzeni, which is the Hefil stem, so it's got a yod to indicate the long I after the bet. Many manuscripts don't have this yod, though. And then in verse 3, elech is spelled defectively, at least when compared with manuscript 178, although it's no shorter than what we find in other surviving manuscripts. There are two things that we can take away from the evidence that we've been discussing. First, the scribe that copied the Nahal Hever manuscript was not averse to plene, or full spellings. Second, there's no evidence that he would have felt a need to alter a long spelling to a short one if he had found a long spelling in his Vorlage. All right, well, I trust that I've demonstrated why Kipp Davis's argument about orthography is methodologically unsound and entirely useless from a text-critical standpoint. Thanks for watching.